No army was supposed to be here. Not in winter, not in these jagged, frozen teeth of the earth. The wind howls through the Alpine passes, a desperate, freezing chorus that strips the warmth from bone. Beneath the snow, the path is a razor edge, barely wide enough for a single footfall. Then, the silence breaks. From the swirling white, a massive form shifts. An elephant. Trunk raised in a piercing, panicked scream, loses its footing on the slick, black ice. The earth gives way. There is no time to stabilize. Beast plunges, men shriek, swallowed by dark. The snow swallows the noise instantly. This was not a march. It was a gamble against the gods. Hannibal stands at the precipice, watching the white void. The cold turns his breath into ice. Yet he does not turn back. The storm rages, claiming the lives of soldiers and beasts alike. But the line moves forward. Every step is an act of defiance against the impossible. They are pushing through the teeth of winter, deeper into a nightmare that would break any other commander. The howling wind of the Alps fades, replaced by the heavy, still air of a temple. Smoke from flickering lamps clings to the stone walls. Young Hannibal stands in the dim light, his presence small against the towering pillars. Before him, his father, Hamilcar, moves into the circle of firelight. The old general does not look at the boy, but at the shadows beyond. He turns, revealing the jagged lines carved into his skin, a map of every defeat. Hamilcar reaches out. Bruising grip, cities to ash, brothers lost.
To the heart of Rome.
Their lives extinguished by a republic that leaves nothing behind but
here.
salt in the fields. Rome
This is
did
the price of our
Hamilcar
victory,
whispers.
Mago.
The words
We
vibrate
must not
in the
falter
confined
now.
space, heavy with the scent of burning resin. Each detail of the lost campaigns is delivered as a physical weight, pressing down on the boy. Hannibal looks up. He sees the burning grief in his father's eyes. A fire that transcends the years. In the silence that follows, the boy breathes in the ash of his ancestors. He realizes the world is not a place of peace, but a stage for a debt that must be paid in full. Hamilcar pulls the boy toward the stone altar.
We must
The
finish
surface
this.
is cold, worn smooth by generations of blood and prayer. He presses Hannibal's palm hard against the granite. The boy does not flinch. He
This
stares
fire
into the
will not
flickering
be seen
flame,
yet,
his
Hannibal.
reflection dancing in the depths of the
father's
fire.
will is our law.
Hamilcar leans close. His
If we are
voice
to win
a
this
low,
war, we must
gravelly
unite
command
Carthage.
that cuts through the
There can be no
stagnant air.
room for discord.
He demands a promise that will outlive them both.
Fuji,
Hannibal opens his
我准备
mouth,
好了.
but
The
the words are not
Carthaginians will
his
never
own.
forget the
They are
humiliation
the
of Sicily.
distillation of every
We will
scar he
return
sees
and
on
we
his
will be
father.
victorious.
He speaks the words, his voice steady and stripped of all childhood tremor. He pledges his life to the destruction of the Republic. He vows to never offer friendship, never seek peace, and never yield until the enemy is broken. As he finishes, the air in the temple seems to sharpen. The boy vanishes. The soldier stands in his place, eyes locked on the horizon of a future war. He releases his grip on the altar. Dusty hand, world shifts. He turns. No longer a sun, but a living blade forged in the heat of a singular, undying purpose. Sun-scorched, temple boy vanished, Hannibal marched. Predatory grace. He did not command from the rear. He rode at the front of every charge, his presence a constant, driving force. His men watched him eat the same dry rations, sleep in the same grit-filled trenches, and walk the same miles through the searing heat. He did not demand loyalty. He earned it through shared hunger and the relentless, punishing speed of his maneuvers. Where other commanders relied on heavy, slow-moving formations, Hannibal favored the sudden strike. He hit supply lines before the guards could wake. He vanished into the dunes before the enemy could regroup. His camp became a place of iron discipline and absolute focus. He learned the rhythm of every soldier under his command. He knew breaking points, power's peak.
Here.
He's a phantom, a force. The men followed him not for gold, but because he was the only one who had never led them to defeat. They became a single, sharp blade in his hand, waiting for the signal to strike. Across the Mediterranean, the marble halls of Rome hummed with the steady, predictable rhythm of an empire at its peak. Reports arrived daily from the southern front, thin scrolls detailing minor skirmishes and bandit raids. In the Senate, the mention of Hannibal Barca drew only bored sighs. To them, he was a footnote. Barbarian king's border raid, a magistrate's petty task. They sipped wine, debated grain prices, and looked at maps that placed the world firmly in their palm. They were blind to the speed of his shadow. They assumed he would play by the old rules of war, the naval blockades, the predictable coastal skirmishes. They did not see the scouts he had already sent into the north, nor did they count the supplies he was quietly stockpiling in the dark, while the Roman elite lounged in their villas, debating the trivialities of provincial taxation. The architecture of their downfall was being drafted in silence. The Senate saw a minor threat that could be crushed with a single legion. Nightmare's dark shadow loomed, closing the distance while they slept in the comfort of their own perceived invincibility. The War Council gathered in the central tent as the sun dipped below the horizon. A map, stained and inked, snaked north on the table. He did not speak at first. He simply placed a finger on the highest, most jagged peaks of the Alpine range. The silence in the room deepened. His senior commanders leaned in. Eyes traced his path. Boots scraped earth. Another let out a sharp, involuntary breath. The proposal hung in the air. A direct march through the forbidden, frozen teeth of the mountains. A man at the end of the table laughed,
do you mean, my
a brittle,
general?
nervous sound, until he looked at Hannibal's face and stopped. There was no hesitation in those eyes. Officers froze, hands gripping table, world tilted. They looked from the map to their commander, seeking a sign of jest, but found only a cold, terrifying certainty. The air grew heavy. The realization settled over them like a shroud. This was not a tactical maneuver. It was a descent into a nightmare that defied every law of nature and war. The order was given, and the army moved as a single, sluggish beast toward the rising frost. They left the warmth of the valley behind, trading solid earth for the treacherous, shifting slopes of the high passes. Within hours, the air grew thin, biting at the exposed skin of the men and animals. The path narrowed until it was nothing more than a jagged razor edge cut into the mountainside. Hannibal led from the front, his eyes fixed on the peaks that seemed to mock their progress. Then, the wind changed. A low, guttural roar echoed through the gorges, followed by a blinding wall of white that erased the horizon. The temperature plummeted. Breath turned into sharp, jagged ice inside the lungs, making every inhalation a struggle. Without warning, the mountain responded to their intrusion. Above them, the snowpack groaned with fraction. A massive slide of ice and rock broke free, tearing down the slope and forcing the falling fortress. The column of soldiers disintegrated into chaos. Men scrambled for purchase on the sheer stone as the white wave descended, swallowing the rear guard in a deafening, pulverizing rush. The ascent had begun, and the mountain was already claiming its toll. The roar of the avalanche died, leaving a silence more punishing than the wind. Cold bit survivors escaping drifts, but snow wasn't their sole foe. The supply lines had been severed hours ago. The grain sacks were buried under tons of ice or lost in the abyss. By the second day, the hunger became a physical weight. It gnawed at the belly, turning clear thought into a haze of exhaustion. Soldiers stared at their gear with hollow eyes. The leather of their straps, the hide of their packs, the stiffened bindings of their boots, it was all that remained. They sliced the leather into strips, boiling what little snow they could melt to soften the material. It was bitter, tough, and barely sustenance. Yet they chewed it until their jaws ached. Every movement cost a precious measure of energy they could not replenish. The army began to slow, the rhythm of the march faltering as men slumped against the ice, unable to find the will to rise. The cohesion of the force was dissolving. In the thin, frozen air, the line between an organized military force and a mass of starving, desperate men had all but vanished. The descent into total collapse stopped when Hannibal halted. He did not issue a command. He did not bark orders at the failing ranks. He simply stepped off the path and sat down in the drift. He pulled his cloak tight against the biting gale and stared into the wall of white. The men around him stumbled to a halt, confused by the sudden stillness. They watched him. He did not shiver. He did not reach for food that did not exist. He let the snow settle on his shoulders until he was indistinguishable from the mountain itself. One by one, the soldiers stood still, their breathing heavy and ragged in the freezing air. They saw the same ice crusting his face, felt the same numbing cold leaching into their bones. He was not a distant figure directing from afar. He was a body in the frost, enduring the exact measure of their misery. A low murmur rippled through the line as the men shifted their weight. They saw him stand. He did not look back, but he began to walk again, his gait slow and deliberate. The soldiers followed. They did not speak, but the aimless wandering ceased. They moved forward, one step at a time, tethered to the man who refused to leave the snow behind. The final ridge was a knife edge of black rock. Hannibal topped the rise, his boots crunching on stone instead of ice. Below him, the world changed. The blinding white of the high passes gave way to the deep, saturated green of the Italian plains. It was a landscape of life, of open rivers and soft earth, untouched by the biting gale. He signaled the column. One by one, the survivors emerged from the pass, blinking against the sudden warmth of the low-altitude sun. They stood on the precipice, looking down at the lush valley that stretched toward the heart of the Republic. The descent was rapid. They moved down the slopes, leaving the frozen dead behind, their spirits sharpening with every step toward the plains. Word reached the first Roman outposts within hours. Scouts arrived at the gates of the nearest settlements, breathlessly reporting an army that had descended from the clouds. The impossible had happened. The mountains that were supposed to be a wall had become a doorway. Panic did not just ripple, it surged through the border towns. The masters of the Mediterranean looked north, not at the sea, but at the sky-high peaks, realizing the predator had bypassed their navy entirely. The nightmare had arrived on land. Cannae's fields, stark and bare, Roman legions massed, earthbound. They were a wall of iron and determination, certain of their superiority. Hannibal stood across the plain, his eyes scanning the mass of approaching shields. He began the maneuver. He ordered his center to move, not forward, but back. The line bent. It receded in a slow, deliberate curve, drawing the Roman heavy infantry forward with the promise of collapse. The Roman commanders saw the gap open. They saw the center fading and shouted with push. The entire Roman mass surged. Boots hammered dirt, a landslide pouring into the void. Confident that the barbarian line was finally snapping under the pressure, Hannibal watched the trap spring shut. Every step the Romans took forward was a step deeper into the embrace. The Romans filled the hollow, their rear cut off. The bait was taken. The field was set. The slaughter was no longer a question of if, but when. The trap snapped shut.
The circle
Hannibal's heavy
closes.
infantry lunged
The
inward from
lions
the flanks,
smell their
sealing
prey.
the gap. The Roman momentum, once a force of conquest, turned into a deadly weight. Crowded chaos, men crushed, the center's plight. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, chests crushed against the backs of the soldiers. The density grew until limbs were locked, pinned to sides by the sheer mass of the crowd. His hand hit a comrade's shoulder. Hannibal's men did not need to fight as much as they needed to finish. It was not a battle. It was a mechanical process. Clanging shields, blades found gaps. The pride of the Republic stood paralyzed, dismantled by the very numbers they had relied upon to crush the world. By dusk, the field had ceased to be a place of war. It was a graveyard of broken standards and unmoving iron. The greatest military force the Republic had ever assembled had been erased in a single light-to-dark cycle. Tens of thousands lay in the churned earth, their silence more deafening than the morning's roar. Hannibal walked the perimeter, his boots stained dark, watching as the final pockets of resistance flickered out. Messengers fled the scene, their horses pushed to the point of collapse, carrying a singular, paralyzing truth toward the capital. When the news reached the Senate, the floor went cold. Men who had governed the Mediterranean with iron decrees stood motionless, grasping the edges of their stone benches. The myth of Roman invincibility had been shattered in a remote valley. Across the sea, the news traveled like fire through dry grass. Kingdoms and city-states that had bowed to Rome for generations suddenly looked up, their eyes wide with the realization that the master of the world had been bled. The balance of power had tilted, and in that moment of collective breath, the entire Mediterranean world shuddered. The predator had been dismantled, and the vacuum left behind was filled with the icy certainty that everything had changed. Hannibal stood at the crest of a ridge, looking down at the field that had defined his life. Thousands of bodies lay in the mud, a testament to his tactical genius. Yet, as the wind whipped across the plain, the victory felt hollow. He looked toward the distant horizon where the roads led back to the capital. He had broken their army, but he had not broken their resolve. He calculated his remaining forces, the exhaustion of his men, and the lack of supplies. The math was simple, and it was devastating. He had no siege engines to batter down the city walls. He had no fresh reserves to replace the men he had lost in the press of the fight. He realized then that Rome was not a single army to be defeated in a day. It was an idea, a system, a stubborn, unyielding collective that would absorb the blow and continue to breathe. He had won the battle, but he was trapped by the scale of his own ambition. The city remained out of reach, its walls standing as a silent, mocking boundary. He had reached the summit of his power, only to find that the summit was a dead end. The war would not end in a final, glorious strike, but in a long, slow grind that would consume everything he had built. The war shifted from the clash of steel to the slow, agonizing erosion of time. Hannibal withdrew, his movements shadowed by the relentless pursuit of his enemies. He watched from distant outposts as the alliances he had painstakingly built began to fray, then snap. Friends and lieutenants fell away, claimed by age or the shifting political tides of a world that had moved on. He spent his days in quiet, dusty corners of the Mediterranean, far from the roar of the front lines. The fire that once drove him to cross the Alps had settled into a cold, hard ember of reflection. He spent hours mapping the terrain of his past, retracing the steps of every march and every failed siege, searching for the moment where the impossible had slipped through his fingers. His life became a series of small, lonely rooms and hushed conversations in foreign courts. The man who had once terrified the masters of the world now lived as a ghost of his own legend, waiting for a finality that he knew was coming. Every sunset brought the same bitter realization. He had been a titan in a world that refused to stop turning. He was no longer a threat to empires. He was a relic of a storm that had long since passed. The end arrived without fanfare. No legions lined the horizon, no trumpets sounded. Hannibal passed into the silence of history, a man who had staked everything on the impossible and lost the gamble. Yet, The earth he walked still bears the mark of his defiance. Rome rebuilt its walls and expanded its borders, but it never forgot the shadow that loomed over its gates. 2 millennia later, the name Hannibal persists, not as a footnote in a ledger of victories, but as the enduring spirit of the challenger. Phantom
Hannibal,
King's oath shook empires.
you must remember your father's lessons.
The horizon is empty, the dust is settled, but the echo of his march remains, a permanent scar on the face of history. He did not conquer the world, but he conquered time itself.